Hey, this is conversation number 38. Obviously, we skipped a week here. We're gonna do some bonus episodes to make up for that. We've had two skips right now, mostly due to me going to the West Coast for work and other things. I'll talk a little bit about that, what I saw, business climate, that sort of thing. But before we get to that, while I was traveling, well, I mean, on Easter, Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, passed, and
So yeah,
there's a what? Yeah. So stuff is going on there. Josiah's a Catholic, as some of you know. I am not, so I think we're gonna have to have him take lead about what's going on here, why it matters. I guess the first thing, and I was saying that I would ask you this because I'm not quite sure what to think of it. The standard line is Francis was a liberal. Can you just explain what that means in the context of a pope? It's not like it's not like he's doing legislation, is he? I don't know.
well, yeah. I mean, they do legislation in the Catholic Church. Both for Vatican City and also canon law, ecclesial law, or whatever. Uh, Pope Francis, is he a liberal? What does that even mean in terms of Catholicism? It's tricky because the the splits between what you might call like liberalism and conservatism in the Catholic Church are, it's very profound and important for people within the church. But from an outsider's perspective, I would imagine that it kind of seems like, maybe not such a big deal, uh, or it's just narrow. So, for example, one of the controversial things that Francis did as Pope is he had this thing saying priests could bless gay couples. Right now, you're not the church is not changing its teaching on homosexuality. It's not changing its teaching on gay marriage, any of that sort of stuff. Is just saying, well, you could have some sort of like vague blessing, right? So that's a big deal from within the Catholic world, but I imagine that from an outsider perspective, it's like, well, what, like that's just whatever. Similarly, another thing was, whether Catholics who were divorced and remarried could receive communion, right? So this is a big controversial issue, and cause all sorts of controversy and crisis within the church. But the church is not changing its teaching on divorce and the impermissibility and possibility of divorce, etc. So I mean, I have to imagine that some of the from outside secular perspective, some of the stuff maybe seems like a little small ball. I don't know. It's not, you know, the and we could talk a little bit about some of the possible replacement contenders for Francis, but there are all these people who get talked about as possible, uh, who might win the next conclave, the next election. But even the most liberal of these candidates is kind of like against abortion, say, right? So it's not. Um, so that's one weird thing. Another weird thing just has to do with Francis himself. He comes out of Argentina, which has its own maybe kind of unusual political tradition. When he was growing up, he was a Peronist, followed Perón. And I think, Perón is one of those kind of figures where like there were left wing Peronists and right wing Peronists. I think he was supposed to be like a right wing Peronist. So I've read a bunch of biographies of Francis, in positive ones, negative ones, and they seem to agree that up until like maybe sometime in the 1990s, he was a pretty conservative guy. Like he's not a standard liberal guy, and he went through some sort of transformation then. But what he ended up in is it's hard to say. I mean, he certainly, as Pope, tended to be allied with more progressive forces in the church, people who wanted to like update teaching to the church to be more in line with like modern sensibilities in the modern world and kumbaya, all that sort of thing. But I don't know that that was necessarily his personality. So it's hard to say. He's a bit of a cipher. I don't
Yeah,
know. As an outsider, like what if any sort of it's hard. Another issue is when you're not only a Catholic but you're like a you know you run in certain circles. You spend like a lot of time thinking and reading and talking about these issues, and you can kind of lose perspective on how much people who are not so hooked into it are even aware that a lot of this stuff is even going on. So I don't even know
mm,
what's what like what's your impression as an outsider of like Francis?
yeah. Yeah, so, Francis is a type of Catholic that non-Catholic, like, liberals who are not Catholic or not even religious really like. That's one thing I noticed immediately, like I said, don't take, like, deep personal interest in it, but I observe people talking about him, they're like, "Seems like a good guy, like, the kinda guy you wanna be pope," and I did think, I'm like, "Wait, this kinda you want to be pope?" Um, that's
Yeah, it's
interesting because like, because
yeah.
you're not a very religious person at all. So, I have seen some of his, the things he says. He seems like, you know, okay, my perspective is he did seem like a sincere person in a lot of ways. I mean, I didn't perceive him to be very Machiavellian, or he might have been, in other contexts of his life. Seemed like he's a pretty good speaker, pretty good extemporaneous speaker that could kind of express the compassionate, um, the humanitarian, not of this world. I mean, all the popes kind of did this. I mean, John Paul II, who was the pope that we were growing up, because he was John Paul II was 1978 to 2005. It was an
Correct.
incredibly long papacy. So that was the pope, not the pope in the background right now, but but But, he, I guess has a more conservative reputation, but he also would say some, like, humanitarian things. Hey, some humanitarian things that, kind of would align with the perception of non-Christians and non-Catholics, uh, with, like, what a Christian or a Catholic would say, like, a holy person, and can I just say it that way? In terms of, like, we're like regular people in the world, and we make mistakes, and we're selfish, and we do things, and, do we really need to buy that car, or do we really need to spend the money on, the extension to the garage, or whatever? Like, we spend things on prosaic things that are for our own, well-being, and we know that if we gave the money to charity or something, maybe that would be, quote, "better," right? If you read the New Testament there's, like, stuff in the book of Revelation, okay, like, there's some apocalyptic stuff in there, there's some weird stuff that, like, people don't, like, talk about that makes more sense in the context of, Judea in the 1st century AD or whatever, right? But then there's other stuff about, loving, turning the other cheek, and, like, the Prince of Peace and all this other stuff where it's like, oh, okay, like, that's, like, very, very, like, highfalutin humanitarian stuff. I think Francis and John Paul II were really good, at sound bites and in rhetorical, uh, responses and extemporaneously expressing that worldview, where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what kind of someone not of this world, but of the, next world, or of the world to be better, expresses. Now, some of this is not always realistic. I remember John Paul II and also Francis, in terms of some of their anti-war stances and stuff. Sometimes I agree with it, sometimes I disagree, but it's pretty obvious they're never going to be pro-war. They're always going to be like pro the underdog. And when it comes to say something like the migration crisis in Europe and Italy, where Francis lived during that time, they're going to be soft, and frankly not realistic, because so I saw some things on social media which was a little unrepresentative, but Okay, I think I told you this the other day. So, some people are so unself-reflected and unself-aware. Like some Twitter user, some anon was saying, "Look, if they nominate a black pope, I'm out." And I just quote tweeted like, "Yeah, I'm not Catholic or anything, but it's like I don't think you were ever in." You
Right.
know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just like, it's like, we gotta pay our bills, we gotta pay the mortgage, we have some attitudes about immigration and other things based on, like, the well-being of our nation, the well-being of our families. Popes don't care about that sort of stuff as much. Like, they do. I mean, Machiavelli's The Prince was about the Pope. The Pope was a prince, for a while, was a potentate, like, in this world, but, not kind of like, since the 19th century, a lot less. The Pope is more of a
Right.
spiritual figure and the head of a church, that engages in various different moralistic, I don't wanna say crusades because like, that's a little too strong, but, it takes, like, stances on moral and ethical issues, whether it be abortion, to some extent the death penalty, um the Catholic Church, Catholic priests have been political actors, like, a lot of people know Latin America and liberation theology, but, in South Korea during the, dictatorial not I think they were dictators, authoritarian periods, in the late 20th century, Catholics and Catholic priests were actually, like, quite involved in the pro-democracy movement. So, in South Korea, Catholics tend to support the social democratic, left-wing, liberal, party, and several of the presidents from that party have been Catholics or lapsed Catholics. I mean, I think the other side has also had Catholics, but generally the Catholics tend to be more represented on that left side, and that's partly because of the history of activism during the period of authoritarian rule. Protestants, there's a lot of Presbyterians and less Methodists in Korea. They tend to be more on the right party, I think. Anyway, so my point here is there's an intersection with the real world because the church is an actor in the real world, and that I think cuts in different directions. But also, I would say my perception of Francis as a speaker is like, okay, this guy. I mean, he's not. I mean, he would be a good Protestant preacher. Okay, is the way I would say it, because Protestant preachers they tend to have a more informal, less magisterial way of speaking to their flock, and I think Francis had that. I think John Paul had some of that too, although, when he was very vigorous, I was a little too small to really notice. I don't think Benedict had that. Benedict was a theologian, and so I think he was a different style of pope, and I don't think people had a really strong opinion of him, actually. Yeah, he was conservative, but the reality is he just wasn't a figure and a face. Because the Benedict period, Pope Benedict, recently deceased Pope Benedict, actually, who I think retired, was it in 2015 or 2013? 2013,
It was
right?
2013. Yeah.
Yeah, so after an 8-year papacy, so it was relatively short as modern papacies go, but he retired because he couldn't handle it anymore, and there's some political issues which you know about. Alright, so, yeah, so that's my perception. I know that there's all sorts of, like, political issues that, Catholics like you and I mean, mostly, like, I listen to, like, people, like not listen to, but I read and listen to people like Michael Brendan Doherty and, um, Ross Douthat, people that I know in the pundit class. I mean, I will say some of the invective against Pope Francis seems like it seems like a little overwrought to me, but I think that's because I don't know the internal politics of the Roman Catholic Church, and there's stuff like, "Oh, like, he's, like, really suppressing the Latin Mass," and all that stuff, and I don't really get that in terms of, like, why would you first of all, why would you suppress it? And then second of all, why would you be flipping out? You know what I'm trying to say? Like, both of them I don't get because 'cause I'm not
Well,
Catholic.
yeah, yeah, both yeah, right. That's a whole thing. Before I get to that, I did wanna say, it's a little ironic, the person who was saying, if they have a black pope, I'm out, for not only for the other obvious reasons, but because the so-called based candidate to replace Pope Francis is a black African, Cardinal Sarah, who is not only like he's very conservative on all the normal stuff, but he's also anti-immigration, kind of. In fact, there are these quotes about how, from him, about how like Europe is going to lose its identity, because it's being demographically replaced by immigrants or whatever. But anyway, I find that's a little funny. But yeah.
I mean, you know what? Like, some people are so racist. They are so racist that they would rather support a gay, pro-immigration white pope. That's how
Right.
racist
Yes.
they
Right.
are.
Um, but yeah, so I think, just to take a broad sweep, if I wanted to, like, you know characterize like the progression of the Catholic Church over the last couple hundred years, is, so for a long, long time, Catholic Church was like a a bulwark of like traditionalism and almost reaction and opposition to the modern world, and all sorts of new like philosophies and whatever. In fact, in the 1860s, the Pope at the time, Pius IX, he came out with a document called the Syllabus of Errors, which was basically a collection of different propositions that, uh, about human rights or whatever, that, liberalism, that he thought was condemned, should be condemned. And there's 80 condemned propositions, and the 80th proposition that was condemned was something like: the Roman pontiff can and should reconcile himself and come to terms with, progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. Right. So he's like, no, that's out. Okay. And then in the 1960s, with the Second Vatican Council, you had attempt to kind of reorient Catholicism to be less oppositional to the modern world. Right. Sort of, stop that oppositional stance and reconcile yourself. The Roman Pontiff reconciled himself to progress, liberalism, modern civilization. And after that, there was a period of what I would describe as like kind of chaos. People didn't really know how much, like, everything seemed like it was kind of up for grabs. You got rid of Latin in the Mass, which was a big, tangible impact for people, and people were saying that all sorts of doctrines were going to get thrown out the window, whether it's contraception or priestly celibacy or so on and so forth. And so that was kind of like a period of chaos. And then when John Paul II came in, he kind of stabilized things, and he did not return really to that um, pre Vatican II, way of doing things, but he kind of stopped the chaos and said that, there was not going to be any further, no more changes, right, basically, and tried to like create some sort of new, um synthesis. Okay. And Benedict, continued that. Maybe he even, started to go back a little bit in terms of like more use of the Latin Mass and some other things. And so the Latin Mass, I think it's important to people, not only, for its own reasons, because of its, beauty, its sanctity, its history or whatever, but it also became a kind of symbol, where it was associated with people who were more of a traditional bent, who more thought that the changes and reorientation of the church after Vatican II was a mistake, and that you needed to kind of go back. And so Francis, part of the reason why he's kind of hostile and wanted to suppress it, is because he feels like it's feeding into that, right? It's giving strength to those, what he would consider reactionary forces, who want the church to return, um, to that way of viewing things, and he doesn't want that. He wants to kind of, move forward and further reconcile the church with, like, the modern world and other churches, other religions, etc. Right. So that's why it can seem like kind of like a weird flashpoint. Um, but often this is the way, right? I mean, it's in Russia. I think when they did liturgical reforms in like the 16th century, 16th, 17th century or whatever, one, like, there was a huge controversy about, when you cross yourself, do you do it with two fingers or do you do it with three fingers, right? I don't even remember which one they said was bad, but There was one that's like, oh, you do three because of the Trinity, and other people were like, no, you do two because it represents the hypostatic union of God and man, and people died over this stuff, right? So they take it becomes like very very serious, and fortunately, I don't think that many people have died over these conflicts over the Latin Mass, but you know, it is important to people, right? And I'm sure, like if our friend Michael Brendan Doherty were here, I think he thinks it's even more important. Like I mean, it's like I think he said that you change the mass, you kind of change the religion, right? You have a new mass, you have a new religion, um, almost. So yeah, these are the sort of things that particularly if you're like a Catholic nerd, right? You
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, from the American perspective, whether you're religious or not, American Protestants, um, Catholicism, the importance of liturgy, the ritual, this sort of stuff, almost not the almost like the literal, the belief of Catholics is there is magic, like in these rites and these rituals in terms of sacrament, transubstantiation, the real presence
right,
of Christ, right there. So that's not a thing in most of American Protestantism, and in fact, like so the dominant tradition is kind of, like it's kind of a radical Protestant tradition where, it's there's not there's not like this old world magic in the church. The church is a place of, like worship and fellowship and that sort of thing. And so I think it's really difficult sometimes for Americans to understand why people be tripping about this sort of stuff. I mean, this is not just, by the way, Catholics. The emphasis on practice and the right is like super important in orthopraxic religion. So in Islam,
right,
when people pray, like you've seen people pray, the people have their hands in front of them, and whether your hands are like hanging down low, kind of like towards the bottom of your abdomen, or like high, maybe towards more your navel, is actually a distinction between different prayer styles of different like legal schools.
hmm
So when I was the TLDRs when I was a kid, I remember like Salafi, basically is, so Saudi Arabian money was coming in to mosques, and, they have a particular style where they hold the hand a little higher, um, when they're standing, and they were telling people that's what you should do. That's actually like I think that's like a Shafi Hanbali style. It's a particular legal school that happens to be dominant in Saudi Arabia. So it wasn't really anything to do with Islam. It was just like their normative practice, and since they were bringing the money, they were like, "You should do it like us because that's the right way to do it." And then there
yeah.
was like a huge argument, and I think my perception is, because I'm not like in touch with the Islamic community, my perception is people realize, wait a second, this is just stupid. I mean, it's like literally like you're talking like 3-4 inches, and like we're having an argument. And I think the Saudis were like, this is not the most important thing. We're not gonna like stress. We're not gonna trip about that, right? But my only point is, these details of practice, details of ritual that like unite a community. Are very important to people because they unite a community. It's like, these are the rules that we agree to. This is how we do it. Like if you go to a church where, there's some churches where it's like, there's not necessarily a dress code, but everyone, like all the males show up in like, a jacket or, whatever.
Right.
There are other churches where like there are people in polos, people in t-shirts. Well, it's just like the community norm, right? In Catholicism and Roman Catholicism, you have customs and traditions that go back literally thousands of years, and those have been the rules that have kind of like united people across centuries, across literal millennia, from the time of Rome down to the present. And so I think like, when you imbue it with supernatural qualities, you imbue it with magical qualities, I mean magical like white magic, not like in some pejorative
Numinous.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like of course people are gonna be very, very preoccupied with it. But the problem is, I just said, transubstantiation. I think, like, for a lot of the listeners, even though our listeners are more conservative, that's gonna be like, "Okay, wait, what does that mean again?" They're going to, like, Wikipedia. So, unless you're a Catholic nerd, it doesn't hit because they don't know all the reference, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have to imagine that even for most Catholics, it's a little hard to say because there's a lot of people who are Catholic, but they, are totally disengaged. They never even go to church or whatever. And, Maybe they don't even believe in God. I don't know, but they say they're Catholic. They're raised Catholic or whatever. So that's one group. But then even among, you know, people who do regular mass goers or whatever, it's not clear to me how much they're even kind of aware of a lot of this stuff, these controversies or whatnot. You have to be pretty hooked in order to be aware to most of it. And maybe that's even healthier in a way because there's not. I have all sorts of opinions on all sorts of things that I have no control or influence over, right? Like I don't. I have opinions about who should be the next pope or who shouldn't be the next pope or whatever, but I don't get a vote. I don't have a say. No one cares what I think about that, right? So maybe it would be easier, better if I just didn't even know about it. If I just wasn't even aware of like the latest controversy or the latest statement that Pope Francis or some other bishop or somebody else said, right? But at the same time, um, even though most people are probably not engaged with it, I do think these things matter. I think these changes matter. I think that um, you can kind of see over the last, I mean, you just to step away from Catholicism, for example, Protestantism is very, um, it's more decentralized, right? And so in the United States, you have kind of seen different church groups go in different directions. Some have kind of fully they've embraced the path that the progressives want, right? And so you go, you kind of sometimes you pass a church and it has like a rainbow flag out and it has Black Lives Matter and maybe there's a cross, I don't know. And you go in and there's on Sundays female pastor and there's like maybe 8 people in the church, right? And they're all average age 65, right? 68 years old. um so some churches, it's the mainline Protestant denominations, a lot of them have embraced that path, and it does not really seem like it's really worked for them. I would say, it hasn't. Um,
Yeah,
you know, yeah, they're
let me
dying.
jump in here because you're using some terms. The mainline Protestants kind of, this is like just refers really to the dominant Protestant denominations in the United States. Like, let's just like, define it like in 1950 or something like that. These are like the Episcopal Church, which is where like a huge number of presidents are Episcopalian, comes out of the Anglican tradition. And upper middle class, upper class, stereotypically Americans, Anglo American, part of the Anglican Communion, and then so they have bishops and everything like that, and then you have Presbyterians, who are basically like comes out of kind of Calvinist tradition. Congregationalists are associated with them, but they went like even more liberal. So there's Presbyterians, but the issue is like in these mainline churches, there's also usually like a conservative branch of the churches that are not necessarily mainline, more evangelical. There's Presbyterian Church USA, which is um, still, I think, marginally. I looked at the numbers. It's not actually as big as you would think, but this marginally still like the more numerous church. It's liberal. I think they have female pastors and everything like that. Okay, the Presbyterian Church in America,
Right.
which
He's
some of people we know, like my our friend Jeremy Carl, and that is an evangelical Presbyterian church. And there's also I think like there's an Anglican church in America which is like super conservative, and so it's one of these things where like on some like supposedly deep theological or like historical questions, the Presbyterian Church in USA and America do share a lot in common, but when it comes to socio-political and maybe like more like contemporary religious questions like the inerrancy of the Bible, the Presbyterian Church USA would have more in common with the Episcopal Church, whereas the Presbyterian Church America would have more in common with, I don't know, like the Missouri Synod
right.
Church of Evangelical, with Lutheran Church, which is the conservative Lutheran branch, as
Right.
opposed to the Evangelical Church USA. So just to, for like, the secular people out there and non Americans, you have all these denominations in America, and they come from like, okay, like Lutherans. You know what Lutherans are. You know what Presbyterians are. Like, in Europe, it would be like more the Reformed Church. Like in the Netherlands. Although we have our own Dutch Reformed churches, that's an ethnic church kind of. But
Yeah.
there's that. We have a lot of Baptists, obviously. I mean, Baptists are much smaller number in Europe, but they're around. They're a much bigger church here in the USA, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, those would be the main ones. There's Methodist, which comes out of kind of originally Episcopal. It comes out of like the American Anglo-American tradition and kind of like the more low church tradition in Episcopalianism. But Methodists also, they tend to be liberal. United Methodist is like the main line of the mainline churches stereotypically, but and Hillary Clinton was Methodist, that sort of thing. Bill would go to her Methodist church, but there's actually also like there's Free Methodists, there's also Evangelical Methodists as well, and so Americans always have this like all these different churches, and they like hit all these like ideological spectrums, and people go church shopping, and like I think that sounds like a little offensive to. I mean, Europeans have told me that that's like an offensive term. Like, what do you mean you don't go shopping? You know what I'm saying? But it's just like,
All right. Well,
that's just
what like
uh,
I guess Europeans don't like shopping in general, but I don't know.
yeah, like they feel like what someone was like. It's like it should not be a consumerist thing, is what they said. But anyway,
Right. Okay. Well,
it's just fine. But I mean but that is the context of America, where it's like you can like go and like you ideologically, culturally, socioeconomically, so like in the American South traditionally, this is like I think changed a little bit, but it was like your class status, um was as a white, let's say white Southerners, your class status strongly was correlated with the church you went to. Like, if you're like lower class, white, you might be Pentecostal, maybe Baptist. Baptists are like a little higher than Pentecostals, and then above them are Methodists, and above them are Presbyterians, and then the planters would be Episcopal.
yeah.
So there, there's a church, or there's a university, the University of the South, I think is what it's called now. It used to be called Seoane, and it was an Episcopal private college, and that the southern rich southern elite would go to. And unlike other Christian colleges in the South, it was a little bit more like very chill about the religion part. So
Right.
that's the one thing I would say. That's like atypical for Southern Protestants, who tend to be like very, have a lot of fervor since the Second Great Awakening. Anyway, that's like a little historical sociological context. I think it gets a little confusing for non-Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's I would say that's a path. The Catholic Church also, I think if you have to look whether it's who actually shows up, like church attendance, how many people are becoming priests, how many people are getting married in the church, all these other things. These numbers are very bad, but that's not just true for Catholics. It's a general kind of secularization across the developed world, and Latin America. I also, to some extent, I would say there are places like Africa or whatever where the church is kind of booming, but in a lot of the traditional, Christian societies, historically Christian societies, uh, Christianity seems like it's kind of fading and it's becoming like kind of like a more cultural thing. And how do you deal with that? And how do you respond to it? Um, that seems like that's a big issue that I think is like the church has to address, and people have different strategies of like how you deal with that. And then what do you do with like other religions, with other denominations, and I think you can kind of get pulled in all sorts of different directions, because people will say, for example, that the Catholic Church needs to like liberalize or do various things with respect to you know women in the church or other political issues, in order to better align with some of the other um, Western groups. But then we also want to try and reunite with like Eastern Orthodoxy or other things like that, where that sort of stuff would draw us further away, like LGBT stuff or whatever. So those are, maybe that's not even the right way to be thinking about it if you're supposed to be the vicar of Christ on earth. But I know that people do think about those sorts of things, and um, especially after Francis, and his kind of moves in that direction, and the like consternation that caused. I guess the like question is, do you want to try like for the next pope? Do you want someone who's going to kind of like double down full steam ahead on that? Do you want someone who's kind of like kind of back off, maybe consolidate a little bit? Do you want someone who maybe will try and chart a new course and reverse course somewhat? Those are things that I guess like the Cardinals are going to have to decide when they have the conclave in a week or two. It's not going to be that long.
Yeah, yeah. Who's running the Catholic Church while there's no pope?
There's uh like the curia basically. So the Pope, he's got basically like his cabinet, I guess you would call it. He's got a Secretary of State, and he's got these other offices, and when he's gone, there's like a setup that's in place that can kind of run things, temporarily until the new pope comes in. Frankly, as with all, major organizations, the bureaucracy, like 90% of it runs itself now, like same with the US government or, other things, right? It can just continue to operate. Eventually you would have like big decisions, but in the past, I mean, I just finished reading a book about the 1559 conclave that elected Pope Pius IV, and that took 6 months. That was from July, I think, until December of 1559, right? So that there have been some conclaves that have gone for multiple years. In fact, the reason why now they sequester all the cardinals, and the reason why they do that is because originally it was just taking too long. The Cardinals were not sequestered or whatever, and they would just like take years to try and pick a new successor. And so finally they decided, okay, look, this is what we're going to do. You all have to go into this room, and you're not allowed to leave, until you come up with somebody, right? That's where the conclave originally comes from, back in the like 12th century or something. Um,
Hmm. Yeah. I guess like the question that I have, now that we're still talking. Let's just finish up on the Pope, the Catholic stuff. Is what is like the practical ramification, I guess, for the rest of us? So let's say you have Cardinal Sarah, like the conservative, okay, and what does that mean? And or what if you have the liberal, which I don't know who that is, but probably someone in Latinx America or the Filipino guy or whatever. I mean, what is and like if you were telling me that I guess only 17% of the Cardinals are now Italian, so probably
right.
unlikely to be an Italian. So what is the relevance? What is the relevance for the rest of us?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess it kind of all depends. The Pope is an international figure. He speaks on a lot of issues. To be honest, he, I think his place in public life is less than it used to be, because it used to be people wanted to listen to the Pope because there were a billion Catholics or however many Catholics in the world, and they would listen to the Pope. So if the Pope said something, they would go along with it. Or these days, the Catholic Church, I would say, has lost a lot of that authority, both because of secularization, because of the abuse crisis, because of other things. And so when the Pope speaks now, mostly people, I mean, it's not that no one listens, but his influence, I would just say, is greatly diminished. And so that's probably going to be true regardless of whoever the next pope is that he'll say some stuff, and if you're interested you can follow it, but you know if you're not interested you can just tune it out, and it won't necessarily affect your life, right? um I think it's probably a bigger issue um in other parts of the world, and like the Catholic Church is a universal organization. So, for example, one thing that Francis did was, there's been a longstanding issue in China with the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church was like officially, you had official bishops, who were approved by the CCP, and then you also had underground bishops or whatever, and who were more persecuted. And Francis worked out some sort of like deal to regularize things, but depending on who you talk to, it was kind of like endorsing the CCP version church or whatnot. So if you were a Catholic in China or even a non-Catholic in China, those are things that could have uh, like real effects on your life. And there are other places in the world, you know. I mean, here's a possibility. So one of the kind of dark horse candidates is this Cardinal Pizzaballa. And I think part of the reason why he gets attention is because he has a funny sounding name, Pizzaballa. I'm not even sure if that's how you pronounce it, but it is Pizzaballa. So it's Pizzaballa. Anyway, he is the he's the Latin patriarch of Jerusalem, right? And so if he becomes the Pope, I expect that that will have a lot of implications and other things, you know, for the church in the Middle East and other things because he's there in Israel. And of course, Israel's big in the news and stuff in Gaza. And he's definitely got opinions and perspectives on that, right? So that's another area where the Pope could who the Pope is could potentially play a big role. Overall, I mean, it's like most things that are in the news don't actually affect your life if you don't want it to, right? You can just ignore it, and probably if you're not a Catholic and you want to just ignore it, you have that option. I guess I would say.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. I think, yeah, I think in America, from American perspective, it's just all like kind of like watching a spectacle of the politics and and the Catholic nerds like nerded out. But I mean, the church is a big institutional force in a lot of poorer countries in particular. It has a its teachings can affect the policy of those countries, but also it's a massive redistribution organization. Like it
Right.
provides a lot of social welfare, and the way it relates to governments has a big deal. I mean, I think this wasn't Ben. It was John Paul, not Benedict. This was, I think, right before John Paul. It might have been Benedict during. I think maybe it was Benedict. The cartoon, the Danish cartoon thing,
That was Benedict. Yeah.
and that was Benedict. And Benedict said some harsh things about Islam, obviously, and you know, uh, yeah. Anyway, but he was also trying to be a little bit compromising in certain ways, and some people were like, "Why are you being such a cuck?" And other people pointed out, look, he has to he has there's a lot of Christians in communion. I mean, there's not that many Roman Catholics, but there's a lot of, Eastern churches that are, under the umbrella of the Roman Pope, you know,
Yeah.
of the
Not
Roman,
as many
of the Pon
anymore, sadly, but yeah,
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 yeah, and so they had to worry about that, like, in places like Iraq. The Chaldean church is, I think, in communion with Rome, and it was a much bigger church back even back then. I mean, I think over the last, 20 years, it's, declined a lot as people have gotten out of there. And even then, the Coptic Christians are not in communion with Rome, but, I think, the Roman Catholic Church, feels like kind of a kinship, obviously, with the Oriental churches, and whatever East West and all these beefs that people use, Chalcedonian, non-Chalcedonian, or whatever beef people have. Ultimately, the reality is, you know, to be candid, American evangelical Protestants can be a little schizophrenic about, on some levels they're like, oh yeah, yeah, we're like in solidarity with fellow Christians, but then they're really philo-Semitic and the alignment with Israel, and sometimes they're like, okay, well, we'd rather pick Israel over. I mean, they're kind of like they've kind of gone down a false path anyway. You know what I'm saying? Like they'll say things like that, or I think the funniest story is there's a book about Eastern Christians that I was reading, and I've heard this, on the radio too, where it's just some Americans, and usually a stereotypically Southern person, will ask, Palestinian Christians because they wear the cross, when they became Christian,
right,
which
yeah,
Palestinian Christians do not like that.
yeah,
Especially because 'cause they're usually service people, so, they can't, say anything snarky, you know? They
right,
just have to explain, well, there was this guy, Jesus.
yeah. That's right. 2,000 years ago.
Anyway, so the Catholic Church, is a global institution, involved in global politics, and so that individual makes decisions. I mean, arguably, William F. Buckley of National Review. I think this is like a debatable point, but it's a point. He thinks that John Paul II, the Polish Pope, was instrumental in the fall of communism. You know,
Yeah.
because he
I think
obviously he
I
took a
mean,
special interest. Yeah.
right. Yeah, I think and I think you have to say that um he played a role, right? You could debate about how big a role or whatever, but he definitely played a role. And so, it was the institution mattered then in a way that it just doesn't as much now. It's like the royal family, like people still um have a lot of interest, in what's going on with Charles and William and Kate and Meghan Markle and all that sort of stuff. But they don't have influence the way that they did in times past, right? And I think that's probably also kind of true from a secular worldly point of view with the popes. It used to be that they could make or break empires, and then even that they had a significant role in geopolitical events or whatever. And that seems like it's becoming less and less true.
Hope you enjoyed the podcast so far. To listen to the rest of it, please go to conversation.substack.com.
Two minds met on a summer's eve, each with truths they long believed. Words flowed like a winding stream as hours passed in deep debate. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. In listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. It's not about who's wrong or right, but understanding others' light. In civil discourse we can find ties that gently bind. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. As dawn broke soft on dewy grass, they smiled and shook hands at last. Two souls enriched by reason talk, united in respect. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, of a long, thoughtful discussion between two public intellectuals. It emphasizes the power of patient listening, mutual respect, and the discovery of common ground. The gentle tone reflects the common understanding they reach after their debate. Would you like me to expand on any aspects of the